Hello fellow kin, welcome back to the channel and welcome to this week's competitive list analysis where we will be covering the very large and very requested Las Vegas Open. For an event of such grandeur clocking in at 910 players, I couldn't possibly do a disservice by covering just one Votann list. And so, in today's video, we'll be looking at the top 3 placing Votann lists at the event, all of which were in the top 12. And let me tell you, these lists are absolutely crazy. As always, we'll be breaking down each list, looking at some of the strengths and weaknesses. However, due to the sheer number of matches across 3 games, we will be omitting the match breakdowns for this video and just focusing on the lists themselves. Before we begin, it is critical that I share 2 special rulings from this event. Number 1, player placed terrain. You can see here a small summary of the terrain pack with 3 example terrain sets below, showing some of the variability seen across tables. Second, and also quite important, this tournament ruled that the effects, such as Grim Demeanor, apply to not only the unit's datasheet, but also to the weapons within them, meaning, finally at long last, you can ignore half damage rules. Praise the ancestors. So with that out of the way, let's jump into the lists. Let's start things off with list 3 today. That came in 12th out of 910 players. Yeah, that's right, I know how YouTube works. We're going to save the best one for last. This list was piloted by Junior Afleji. Sorry if I mispronounced her last name. And the matchups here were pretty tough all around. We kicked things off with a Votann versus Votann game mirror matchup of 100 to 57 for Junior. Votann versus Eldari at 70 to 69. Very close game here. Votann 82 to Adeptus Sororitas at 46. Very nice win. Votann 89 victory against Thousand Suns at 28. Votann 100 victory versus Ultramarines at 95. Votann 90-point victory versus Eldari yet again at 79 points. And then a final defeat of Votann at 57 versus Tyranids at 84. The list placed 12th out of 910 players, holding 6 wins and 1 loss. Now, as we make our way through these lists, I want you to pay attention to them. And you're going to probably notice that there's a trend here that we see with certain units that were selected. And I think it's really interesting because we don't see it very often, especially outside in other events. I would argue this is the only event where I've seen this trend happen. So just try to pay attention to that and we'll touch on it towards the end of the video. For this list, we're looking at a Brokier Ironmaster with the Appraising Glare enhancement. He's probably going to be leading a 6-man unit of Brokier Thunderkin, each equipped with Graviton Blast Cannons. A very solid choice here to start things off if you're going to be including Thunderkin. I mentioned this in another video, but I really do think the 6-mans are the most efficient way to run these things. You really don't get enough power out of 3, and the variability is just too high that it's unpredictable. But with 6, at least you account for some of that variance, and it helps to even out your damage. I like the choice of Appraising Glare. I don't think it's a bad enhancement. I think it's actually quite nice. So Appraising Glare lets you pick an objective and units that are on account as having an extra judgment token. I think this could be good. There's a lot of synergy with something like this, especially when you have so many small units that are around the table. It really helps you just accrue those judgment tokens a little bit easier, particularly for your Thunderkin, because ultimately they're always going to be wounding on 2s if you're putting them into the correct targets. And the correct targets should be vehicles. They do have play into infantry as well because of their blast, but the profile is really reliant on you getting the most out of it by wounding on 2s for vehicles. So if you're able to get +1 to hit just by having a judgment token on a couple key units, this really helps make the Brokier Thunderkin shine. Next up, we have an Iron Champion. The Iron Champion is taking Grim Demeanor. Now, like I said before, Grim Demeanor is a staple you'll see throughout these lists simply because of the ruling that Grim Demeanor applies to the weapons, which is great. I think this is how it was designed, and I think this is honestly the intent behind it. Now, what you'll also notice here is that this Iron Champion is running a Mass Hammer. I think that the Mass Hammer is very strong, especially with Grim Demeanor, because that's how you get the most value out of it. There's absolutely no point in running a Dark Star Axe because you don't really care about your damage tool being halved, whereas with the Mass Hammer, now if this thing gets through, you're looking at D6 plus 1 damage. This could spike. The Iron Champion is going to be leading a squad of 10 Hearthguard, and these Hearthguard are equipped with standard Concussion Gauntlets and Vulcanites. Very strong loadout here, which we'll touch on in a minute. Next up for leaders, we have the Cal. The Cal is running Vulcanite Disintegrator with a Mass Gauntlet. Very standard here as well. Now, interestingly, it's not entirely easy to determine who's leading what, and I think this is quite interesting. It's more than likely that the Iron Champion with the Grim Demeanor is going to be running with the 10-man Iron Hearthguard squad in Deep Strike. because if you get them down, that's a lot of shots. You get to ignore any penalties to your weapons. You just get more value out of this. Especially coming from Deep Strike, you get to reroll the charges, always helpful. That means the Cal is likely running with the 5-man Hearthguard unit, and again, this is fine. He's going to be adding a little bit extra value. There's only 5 Hearthguard there, so if you get some lethal hits, it might help a bit. Overall, not entirely sold on the Cal being here for specific Hearthguard support. Rather, I think he's here just to get some of that extra generation going with your Judgment tokens, because again, with the Cal, you do get the ability to do that, and this synergizes quite nicely with the Broker Thunderkin because they're so reliant on that +1 to hit. The more efficiency that you can get out of these units, the more they're going to perform on the table. And when your list runs 12 Broker Thunderkin, you kind of want them to do work. It also just helps you add a little more board presence. You pick a couple units out essentially every turn with your enhancement and with your Cal that are always going to have some tokens on them. So no matter where you're positioned around the table, whether it's with your Berserks, whether it's with your Hearthguard, or even your vehicles, you get to do some extra damage because of that +1 to hit. For troops, we're looking at 10 Hearthkin Warriors. It's not really anything crazy for loadouts. We've got an L7 missile launcher and a magma rail. Again, you can't really go wrong with any loadout on these. You'll notice in some of the other lists they're running something a little bit different, but I don't think that this has a tremendous impact on the game. Really, these guys are here just to score, they're here to hold, and they're here to just get you sticky objectives. And, of course, fill your Sagittars. Now, for the real meat of the list, we're looking at 6 Broker Thunderkin with Graviton Blast Cannons, and 2 squads of 3 Broker Thunderkin with Grav Blast Cannons as well. I think this is interesting. So he opted for one big 6-man, which is obviously going to be accompanied by the Iron Master. You just get a lot of value out of that because of that innate +1 to hit, and the extra wounds that you can allocate to the ECOGs and the Assistant. Just pretty nice, a very good combo here, nothing wrong with it. Now, he also has 2 squads of 3. Initially I look at this, and I wonder why he didn't opt for a squad of 6, but it kind of makes sense with a loadout like this. If you look at even the setup with the Ioneer Hearthguard, he's got one big squad of 10 and one squad of 5. I think he's trying to mirror that with this. So you see here you got the big squad of 6 and 2 squads of 3. It just gives you a little bit more mission play and a little bit more board control. You get to pop in from reserves more than once with this and in several different places, which is nice. It gives your opponent something to think about, it keeps them honest, and they have to be careful where they're going. Plus with the Cal and the Praising Glare being in your list, you're going to be able to pretty reliably have one token at different places across the board, which means no matter where you come in from, you will get that +1 to hit with your Broker Thunderkin, which again gives them more value. Next up, we have one squad of 5 Berserks. I really like the Berserks. I'm currently running one squad as well. I feel like I need a second. Well, I thought I did, but after playing them for a while, I do feel like one might be enough. It really reminds me of the older Blood Angel days. I think it was in 9th, where you'd be running one squad of Death Company with jump packs, and you would just keep that there for that early game threat. Obviously this is a little more of a later game threat, but because they don't have jump packs, but the idea being you have this unit that your opponent needs to constantly be aware of. It's like, okay, here you got the Berserks, they're staging behind a building, behind a ruin. I can't really bring my Terminators out because if these guys got a charge on them, they're probably going to pick up the squad. So I got to be a little more careful, I got to be a little more cautious, and I have to respect them, which means it gives you more board control. Always nice. Just a little token tech piece here. I think it's great. Moving along, we have 3 squads of 3 Pioneers. The Pioneers are really good. They're cheap at 90 points each currently. They do okay shooting, but you really don't want to take these for shooting, honestly. You're really looking for the ability to quickly redeploy from any edge of the board, or have that early game pressure to score secondaries with their scout move. That's what these guys are here for. It's all about secondaries. And when your list is reliant or running a lot of heavy hitting units such as Broker Thunderkin or Ioneer Hearthguard, these guys are relatively stationary. They don't move. Once they get to somewhere, wherever they want to be on the board, they typically stay there, and that's where they die. With the Pioneers, you use these a little more defensively, but you're able to send them out quickly and quite far, and they'll be able to score you some objectives, or secondaries, which is always nice. Next we have the Big Hammer, and this consists, as always, as 10 Ioneer Hearthguard. These guys are running Concussion Gauntlets, and they're running the Vulcanite. It's a staple, it's a standard unit, it does work. That's why it's always here. Just very efficient at killing, and this is likely paired with the Iron Champion with Grim Demeanor because you want to get that extra value out of them. With 10 guys here at 300 points, you want to make sure that whatever they touch, it's going to die. And so by having Grim Demeanor on the unit, you ensure that your damage to weapons always connect. Rounding off the infantry, we have 5 Iron Hearthguard. These are more than likely going to be running in the Hecaton Landfort, but the player did take a teleport crest on them, which is interesting. This, to me anyway, implies that we're looking to have the option or flexibility of either putting these guys in Deep Strike or stuffing them in the Landfort, and I really like that. Flexible deployment is always great because you can decide how you want your Hearthguard to come into the table. Do you start them off in the Landfort? Do you rush them to the middle and try to hold that? Do you put them in Deep Strike? You have options, and options are always great. It gives you a little extra viability into anything you might be facing. I quite like this choice. I think it's nice. I'm a big fan of the Hecaton with 5 Iron Hearthguard inside. It does work, and so having that option available to you is always good. For transports, we're looking at 3 Sagittars. We don't see 3 Sagittars very often, but this is something I want you to note and pay attention to because the choice of 3 Sagittars here very much aligns with what we discussed in some of our other videos, where we're looking to run L7 missile launchers instead. Why? Because they're just so variable. They're so swingy. Sustained hits D3, D6 damage. There's no consistency there. Sure, you can spike, but you might also just flop. You might whiff. And so having a predictable 3 damage shot with a missile launcher, which is also flexible into some lighter infantry as well with its alternate firing mode, is quite nice. Overall, opting for L7s when you're running fewer than 4 does make a lot of sense because you just want to play something a little more predictable. And I think this also makes sense because you're running Thunderkin, which are also quite variable. So if you can average out that variability or help reduce it a little bit by adding something consistent to offset it, I think that's always a very good trade. Last but not least, we have the Hecaton Landfort. This guy's running SP Conversion Beamer. It's my preferred loadout option as well, with the Ignore Cover and the Twin Bolt Cannons. These units are quite hard to shift. They're surprisingly durable, especially with Void Armor, and they do work. There's nothing funner than rolling SP Conversion Beamer and yelling conversion when you roll a 4+. It's a great feeling. Overall, you have some really strong anti-tank, some really good anti-infantry, and some powerful anti-elite. A very well-rounded list, leaning into the shooting archetype of Votann. For strengths, I think this list is cool because there's a lot of activations. Like I said regarding the Thunderkin, they get to come in from reserves, and you could bring them in at 3 different table corners essentially because you have 3 different units. I think that's really great. You also have flexibility with the 5-man Hearthguard, which gives you an extra activation as well. And there's a flexible deployment with that, as I mentioned before, because you can choose if you want them coming out of the Landfort or if you want them coming down from Deep Strike. This list has excellent mobility and scoring, predominantly through the bikes, as they're quickly able to travel around the board while your main targets deal with bigger threats and draw fire. Ultimately, it's a really well-balanced list. Your opponent can't really afford to ignore anything that you're running, especially not the Thunderkin or the Hearthguard, which means your bikes, if they do choose to target them, will result in a trade where you end up destroying their key units. There are a couple weaknesses that I identified with this list, and again, you know, it's the Thunderkin for me. They're just so variable. It's hard to get predictable damage with this, and if your opponent has cover, you have no way of ignoring that, and cover is very easy to get, so you do natively lose some efficiency. I guess when you're running 6 of them, you make up for that variability, and it also allows you to position yourself better. Maybe you could get a couple angles that would allow you to ignore cover on certain targets. Another weakness, which is more of a question, is it worth sacrificing the ability to spike on your Hylas for the Sagittars for a little more stability with the L7? I'm not really sure. This is a decision I'm personally torn on for my own lists. I've tried both, and I think I'm leaning towards the Hylas, even though I know I probably should go with the L7 if I'm running less than 4. I'm not sure. I'd be curious to hear what the pilot thinks about this, and if he would have preferred, in hindsight, running the bigger gun. I think one con here that we can see is that this list might be hurt by good screens. If you're playing against a horde army, it might be a little tough for you to get your Gravitons into position, especially since they're so reliant on coming in from reserves to do anything. Likewise with your bikes, it'll be tough for them to come in and get a good spot to do any secondaries. I also want to point out that since this is a little bit more of an all-rounder list with an emphasis on shooting, it means you get a little bit of everything, but everything's a little less efficient. I included a little breakdown here, which is typically not very helpful, but I think in this case it might be, because we could see that the list is really heavy on elites, being infantry units, and I differentiate the light infantry from troops, as you can see here in red. This is a little different than what we're used to seeing in some of our other videos, where vehicles make up the large majority of the lists. Could this be a factor of player plays terrain? Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. Alright, next up, coming in at 11th out of 910 players with a 5 wins and 2 loss streak, we have List 2, piloted by Drew Salzborn. That's right, Drew Salzborn made it back into another one of my videos. Those of you who have stuck around on the channel will remember him from one of our other videos we covered, where he plays pretty well in a competitive event. Matchups this time included Votann with 100 points against Astra Militarum at 59, a 65-60 victory for Votann into Ynnari, an 89-point victory against Black Templars at 71, an 86 win against Eldari at 57, so again, doing quite well into Eldar, an 83 victory against Orcs at 52, and a 90-point defeat to Eldar at 91. Very close game. And then ultimately, another final loss of 77-90 against Eldari. A lot of variability here with the Eldar matchups. Looking at the list, we have an Ioneer champion with Grim Demeanor, taken as the enhancement. Again, he's running Mass Hammer. This is a no-brainer choice, I think, in an event like this, where the Grim Demeanor allows you to apply its effects to weapons. The Mass Hammer is such a powerful tool to bring to the table, and being able to ensure that if you get any damage through, it is fully taken by your opponent is absolutely massive. We also have a Grimnir taking Appraising Glare. Again, I think Appraising Glare is a solid choice here. It always gives you the option to have an extra token on the board, or 2, depending on which objective you select. We have a second Grimnir, no enhancements here, followed up by a third Grimnir with no enhancements here. So already a very, very interesting start to the list. And we'll take a look at this in a little more detail in a second. Pay attention again as we see only 3 Sagittars taken for dedicated transports, and again they're all running the L7 missile launcher. Could this be the start of a new trend? Moving along, we have 3 squads of 10 Hearthkin warriors. Now these guys are running something a little different. They're running the High-Las rotary cannon and the High-Las auto rifle. Again, I personally don't think the loadout has too much of an impact on the game. These guys are just chaff. They're here to score points. They're here to be a little bit annoying, sticky some objectives, and just put some of that mission play pressure on your opponent. Now, let's focus on this for a little bit. Already we see an interesting scenario happening where we have only 3 dedicated transports, but potentially 3 occupants with the Grimnirs and 30 other occupants with the Hearthkin warriors. So who gets to ride in the transports, and who walks, or who goes into Hecaton Land Fortress? And that's what's really interesting about this list. It's that the pilot gets to decide whenever he wants. Every game. He could pick and choose depending on his matchup what he thinks would be better, what he thinks would be necessary. Is he playing against an army where he needs to keep his Hearthkin in the back, sticky objectives because he knows there's going to be some deep strike threats? Can he afford to play aggressive and leave a Grimnir behind? Would he rather send out his Grimnirs to take objectives, with a Chthonian Berserker squad as backup in one of the Sagittars? Or should he leave his Berserk squad back, just in case there's an early game threat against something such as World Eaters? Just a really fascinating design choice here for his list, as the options are honestly limitless. Something really fun that he could also do is stick a couple Hearthkin's warriors inside of a transport. Maybe he puts 5 into the Sagittar, and he puts 5 into reserve. This allows him to get a little bit more board control, a little more secondary play. It's honestly really interesting. I've been looking at this for a while. I actually had to pause the video to think about this for a second because there are so many options. He could throw the Grimnirs in the land fort, he could put the Hearthkin warriors there instead. Maybe he just wants to run a full 10-man squad into Fortress and stick that onto an objective. The options are actually limitless. It's really fun to have a list like this where you get to pick and choose at the start of the game what your game plan is. And it's different every game. Really cool and interesting design choice, I have to say, and I really appreciate that. I mentioned another 5-man Berserk squad here with the Mauls. Another, again, possible new trend emerging as we saw with the first list that came 12th. I think this is a solid choice here. It's a little token piece. We keep this one either in the back or we send it out in a Sagittar to stage, depending on what our needs are. And again, it really just helps to keep our opponent honest. And by that what I mean is, if they play too aggressive, well, your Berserks could come out, sacrifice themselves and kill something in the process. Or if they play too defensive as a result of that, then they did their job. Coming down for our hammer here, we have the Ironeer Hearthguard 10-man squad. These guys are running gauntlets again, but they're also running plasma, which is quite interesting. Typically, if you do decide to run plasma, you'll always see them accompanied by a Cal for the lethal hits. In this case, we are not running that. We are running the Ironeer Champion with Grim Demeanor, and I think this works in a situation like this because Grim Demeanor would apply to your plasma, so your opponent can't actually ignore anything. You're immune to modifiers, which is great. You just get the most value out of those guns. And again, of course, they're melee weapons as well. What's also nice is that the Ironeer Champion gives you a native reroll charge, which is good coming out of Deep Strike or Strategic Reserves as well. Just helps ensure that your hammer connects with its target and you're not just left out in the open. Rounding the list off, we have 3 Hecaton land fortresses. So the land forts are sick, they're really cool. We've seen another list before that was running 3 land forts as well. But this one is interesting because he's running cyclic ion cannons across all 3. I typically wouldn't consider bringing this in a list, but I think it kind of works because basically the stat profile here is 24 inches, d6 plus 3 shots. You're hitting on 4s unless they got a judgment token. You're strength 9, you're -2, and you're 2 damage. But you're also blast. So a very strong elite and infantry profile here. The reason why I think this selection works well in this list is because you don't really have a lot of shooting anywhere else. I mean, you got your Hearthguard that come down, but they're running plasma, so they only have a shot each. Then you got your 3 Sagittars, but they have missile launchers, so their damage is quite stable to anti-vehicles. So you don't have all that much to take care of infantry. So I wonder if the deliberate choice was made because he recognizes that his list actually lacks shooting. He's running such a tech-heavy list to score secondaries here for mission play, with the Grimneers, the Hearthkin spam. All he's looking to do is get objectives, get secondaries, score as quickly as he can. He's got his big Hearthguard brick that comes down. It's efficient. He has his Sagittars to pick up any vehicles that could be threatening him, but he's got to commit all 3 to take it down. And so with the land fort, I think he's looking for just these big, tough bodies that can clear away any chaff, that can clear away any elite threats, any infantry that comes at him. And so this is where he decided to build his shooting platform out of, the land fortress. Just a really interesting decision, and not one we see too often. Or often at all, for that matter. Strengths. I think this is an extremely unique design. I mentioned this a few times while reviewing the list, but just running so many tech pieces, that's absolutely crazy. It's so cool and interesting to see a design choice like this, running these unknown weapons on vehicles that opponents probably don't have a lot of experience playing into. I think this is all really powerful and great stuff. Another strength is that you have really good secondary play out of reserves if you decide to run your Hearthkin warriors like that. Alternatively, you could just throw them into a land fort, run them up the board, and stick them onto objectives. Sure, you lose out on having some of the bodies, but it makes them slightly more durable by adding extra wounds, or doubled body count, and it lets you get there quickly and safely. You have flexible deployment. Like I mentioned, do you want to put your cows into transports? Do you want to keep your Berserks behind? Do you put your Berserks in and forward deploy them? Do you want to split your warriors out and put some into reserves? The choices are endless, which means you have a lot of play into a lot of different lists. You have very strong board presence similarly in a list like this because you get the 3 land forts that move up to the center of the table, deploy their cargo, and they just sit there. You have your Hearthguard and Deep Strike ready to come down either through Rapid Ingress or just regular Deep Strike and take care of any large threat that might be pushing towards your midboard, which acts almost like a panic button. Well, really your hammer. And lastly, I think there's really interesting unit interplay. Just something really interesting, and we never really see this. That said, there are a couple weaknesses with such a tech-based list like this. The first one is that you have a lot of bodies to score, but as a result of that, you do have lower damage. And on a similar note, it's a very technical list. I think it takes a lot of skill to pilot something like this, and it's not a typical setup that we'd see, or a typical archetype for that matter. So something like this is really player skill dependent. I think it has a super high ceiling, and it's tough to play. That means any mistakes can result in your early loss, because you simply won't have the correct resources available to make the list function, whether that's scoring or just doing raw damage. I think that there's a debate that could be had as to whether a Cal should be ran versus the champ. Maybe it ultimately just came down to points, but I do think a Cal would work nicely. But again, I can understand with the point restrictions. The list has very good staying power through its Hekaton land fortresses, but it is a bit slower. Could this have benefited from having some fast attacks such as the bikes, or would that just shift the archetype a little too much? Overall, a very fresh and cool list. Something that I'd be curious to try running myself. Okay guys, last but not least, we have the highest placing Votann list from LVO, coming in at 5th out of 910 players with a 7 wins, 1 loss streak, piloted by Sweet Lou. The matchups included a 95 to 81 victory against Admech, much closer than you would think. A Votann 95 to Tyranids 41 victory, a 99 to 40 victory against Orcs, a 73 win against Astra Militarum at 64, a Votann 63 victory against Necrons at 60, close game, an 89 victory against Orcs at 70, and a Votann 100-point victory against Adeptus Sororitas at 54. And lastly, a defeat of 60 against Necrons at 100, the very same Necron player that would go on to win the tournament. Taking a look at the list, it's absolutely bonkers. I would never have thought to see something like this. It's absolutely insane, and it looks like, honestly, so much fun to play, especially on player place terrain, which I think was a huge factor. Just an absolutely oppressive shooting army, very aggressive. It's really cool. But we'll jump in and draw our conclusions towards the end. So starting it off, we have a Brokir Ironmaster with a long list enhancement. Long list allows you to essentially just transfer a judgment token from one killed target to another target instead. He's going to be paired with one of the Brokir Thunderkin squads, probably the Gravitons. We have another Brokir Ironmaster with Appraising Glare, attached to likely a second Brokir Thunderkin with the Gravitons. Now I mentioned this a few times, but Appraising Glare is quite nice here because, especially if you're running Thunderkin, they're exceptionally dependent on that +1 to hit. So by giving your army the ability to place a +1 to hit token somewhere on the board, for whatever unit's in range of it, that's quite helpful. Just helping you to get the most value possible out of that unit. Lastly, for characters, we have an Ioneer champion. He's running Grim Demeanor, and again, he's running the Mass Hammer. This is a staple throughout all the lists, and understandably so. It's just very powerful. You put this on a 10-man Hearthguard unit, and they're going to do damage. Next up, we have a 10-man Hearthkin Warrior squad here. So these guys are running the Hylas Auto Rifle and Hylas Rotary Cannon again. I like the Auto Rifle. I think if you have to go for a shooting option, that's probably your best choice, simply because it makes you able to get at the assault keyword, which means that particular 5-man unit, once they split up, they get to advance and still do a secondary because they count as being eligible to shoot. Very helpful and nice little tech piece. Now for the real meat and bones of the list, the reason you're probably all here, we have 6 Brokir Thunderkin with Gravitons, followed by another 6-man Brokir Thunderkin with Gravitons, followed by a third 6-man Brokir Thunderkin squad running SP Conversion Beamers. What? I completely forgot that was even a gun option for these guys. I had to look that up on the app, and it's crazy. It's like I look at that and I'm wondering, how is this even doing damage? But it just worked. For those of you that are unfamiliar with it, the SP Conversion Beamer is a 24-inch range, one shot, hitting on 4s without a token, strength 7, -1, 3 damage. But it has conversion, which means on a 4+, you get sustained. And much like its brother, the Hekaton Land Fort, who also has SP Conversion Beamer, its sustained hits D3. So you have the potential to spike again with something like this, just adding even more variability to an already very variable unit. I said this list is crazy, and that's because there's such an investment on the Brokir Thunderkin. I honestly want to go buy more of them just to try this out. It's crazy, the amount of shooting you can do. It's fun. It's obviously very fun just to pick up your dice and shoot with these guys. They're beautiful models. They're very, very efficient into vehicles. And the SP Conversion Beamer, looks like it's a solid choice into elites. Something that the army might be lacking, and obviously making up for that. Next up, we have another 5-man Berserk squad. I say another because it looks like there's a trend here that has been established. All 3 of these lists that top placed at the LVO event are running one 5-man squad of Berserks with Mauls. Personally, I'm a huge fan of this. I've been seeing it for a while. I think they're very strong, and I'm happy, honestly, on this wonderful journey they've taken since the start of the index, where everybody said they were terrible, to finally making it to the spotlight at the top of an event. Absolutely beautiful. Next up, we have 3 3-man squads of Pioneers, identical loadouts here, the very standard high-las rotary cannon with a scanner and searchlight. These guys are going to be playing secondaries all day long. I struggle to think of anything better at scoring secondaries in an army such as Votann. These guys are fast, they have scout, they redeploy, they come in from reserves at the end of your opponent's turn. Well, go in at the end of your opponent's turn and come out at the beginning of yours, making them very exceptional tools to fulfill that role. Next up, we have the classic hammer. We're looking at 10 Iron Year Hearthguard, running the gauntlets, running the Vulcanites. Very strong, very efficient, especially with Grim Demeanor. I won't focus too long on these, as I think I've said enough in the past 2 lists, but just a staple hammer unit to have. They will always do damage with Grim Demeanor, and you get the most amount of value possible out of them. Next up, and you may have noticed, yet again, just 3 Sagittars. It's rare to see less than 4, no matter where you go on forums or online, but here we go, 3 Sagittars making it to 5th place out of the event. And I want to call out here that this pilot opted to run high-las beams on these, meaning he's going for that variability, he's going for the potential to spike. This is interesting, because there's a difference in thinking styles here as we see from the other lists. There isn't necessarily a right or wrong choice. I think it's just a matter of weighing the options and determining what your risk tolerance is for something like this, depending on how your list is built. I actually think the L7s would work pretty well in this list, considering he has 2 6-man squads of Thunderkins that are running Gravitons, just to help offset some of that inconsistency with stability. But I kind of just appreciate him going all in on the randomness and hoping to spike in damage. It does work, because you have so many options here that are shooting into appropriate targets, such as vehicles in this case, that surely it'll average out and you'll be able to do effective damage. It also means that your Sagittars become legitimate threats again for your opponent. They simply can't ignore something running around the board that does D3 sustained hit shots and is D6 damage. Meaning, maybe this helps take some pressure off of your Thunderkin who are coming in from reserves, or at the very least, makes your opponent have to think. Last but not least, we have the Hecaton Land Fortress, making it to 5th place at this event. And this is running the SP Conversion Beamer. Huge fan, I've said it before, I'll say it again. It's just a solid option. The most all-rounder, I think, and just the most stability in terms of damage output. I also think he complements the list quite nicely here, because what you're looking for is just a big body to stand in the middle of the table, soak some fire if need be, and one that can't be ignored because of that Conversion Beamer option. The Sagittars run around to support them, helping to score, moving some key pieces into position, the Berserks, the Hearthkin Warriors, while your Pioneers go off on the sidelines and score you some nice secondaries. A very aggressive list rounded off with the Hearthguard coming down from strategic reserves, supported by a very aggressive shooting detachment here from the Brokir Thunderkin 3x6, absolutely annihilating anything they touch. Now, I want to retouch upon the SP Conversion Beamer here on the Thunderkin. I do kind of think it works in this list, although I think it's absolutely ludicrous. Like, it's insane. I don't know how it works, but it seems to work. And if I had to theorize why, I think it's because it just gives you some more options. It gives you damage 3, really. I think that's what we're looking for, is the ability just to get some damage 3 here in the list, because it's rare for our army. Like, think about it, right? The Berserks are damage 3 melee, but it's quite hard to find damage 3 shooting anywhere else. And the Hearthguard are running Vulcanites because you absolutely need some anti-infantry killing capabilities with this list. While the Brokir Thunderkin with Gravs can technically tech into that because they have Blast, they're not really used to the most of their efficiency by shooting into infantry. They're looking for anti-vehicles. And so I think by just running one token squad with the Conversion Beamer, it just helps give you some options. And with 6 of them, you're probably going to get a conversion in there, which will help average out the damage. It also is a great support to the land fort, who's also running a conversion beamer. So now you have pretty reliable 3 damage shots coming out at your opponent, picking up any heavy elites, chipping off vehicles pretty significantly. All in all, it's very fun, it's very cool, and it seems to be very effective. Touching on some strengths, I think it's an extremely unique design. Again, not something many people get to play against, so I think it caught a lot of people by surprise. It has very strong secondary play with the bikes moving in and out of reserves, super flexible as well with your deployment and how you want to set yourself up. It has absolutely insane firepower with the Broker Thunderkin. Once these guys are on the table, they can reliably pick anything up. Absolutely. You also have clear unit roles like I mentioned before. Everything in this list is clearly defined to play a specific part, and do that part very well. You also have some redundancy with the Thunderkin to help reduce that overall variance. I struggled to find some weaknesses with this list, but I do have a few that might be considered weaknesses, or maybe just questions to consider. Is a list like this too reliant on destroying screens? I'm not sure. You can't really afford to start your Thunderkin in your deployment zone since they're so slow and so susceptible to shots, but at the same time, what if you can't really get a good angle coming in from reserves, since you're screened out? Something to consider. It's also quite swingy, but I think the pilot kind of just embraces that and goes all in, doubling down, and it somehow just works. I guess the amount of variance you've included through your number of shots and the number of damage dice you're rolling just balances out and averages in the end to get something a little more reliable. Another consideration is the value of having a Cal versus a Champ, but I think ultimately it just comes down to points. The Champ is quite cheap, and the Cal is honestly a little too expensive for what he does. I wish the Cal was cheaper, because I think it would make list design a little more interesting and actually create some meaningful choices with who you select to fit in lists. Lastly, is this list a little too reliant on keeping your bikes safe in order to score secondaries? It's a question that I have, and one that the pilot could probably share after playing through 8 games. For instance, if you're against a lot of out-of-sight shooting, what happens if they pick up your bike squads early game? What else do you have to reliably score you secondary points across the table? You do have units coming in and out of reserves, but again, are they deterred by any screens that your opponent might have? What do you guys think? Undeniably, looking at these lists, I think we have some pretty clear indicators that perhaps there are some archetypes for Votann that have not yet been explored. Could this be the start of a new meta? There are some very clear trends that were shown here. We could see some strong performances in these lists without a super big reliance on running Sagittars. Why is that? Could it be because they're anticipating the data slate? Maybe there's going to be a points bump and they want to prepare themselves to play around that in the future with their lists? Or, more likely, maybe opponents are just too used to playing against 6 Sagittars. We saw a few weeks where the win rate for Votann was quite low and they didn't have any top placements, and a lot of the comments people were mentioning were that Votann are just too predictable. Could this be an attempt at subverting expectations against the Leagues of Votann and trying something new that will take people by surprise? All the top performing lists ran 1x Berserk squads with Mauls. Why is that? We've seen several examples in the past of top performing lists running 3 units, so what changed? Could this yet again be a good attempt at subverting expectations? Or have people figured out that maybe all you need is really just 1 unit of these guys? Sure, they're tough and they do a lot of damage, but what's the trade-off for sacrificing 200 points into them? I think another takeaway point is that Broker Thunder can perform best when you actually commit to running them. And by commit, I mean running at least 12. It makes sense, really. These guys are undeniably swingy, so adding some redundancy just helps to average out your damage overall, especially over the course of the game, or in this case, several. Is there a new meta approaching from shifting away from vehicles in favor of leaning into our aggressive shooting? What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. All I can say for sure is I know I'm definitely going to go buy 2 or more kits of these guys after this video, because I absolutely need to try this out. Maybe I was a little too harsh on them. Anyway, huge congratulations to the players covered in this video, and of course to everybody else who attended this absolutely massive event. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next one.